What's up, everyone? If you're just joining us, we'll probably get started in about 5 minutes. Just want to give people a chance to stream on in. So stand by, 5 minutes. If you just joined us, we're going to get rolling here at about 5 after, whatever your local time is. So 5 after 12 if you're Eastern time, and then whatever 5 after is in your locality. Talk to you soon. In the meantime, please enjoy this smooth jazz. One minute countdown before we get things started. Thanks to everyone who's here, and excited to get things rolling here shortly. All righty. Thank you to everyone who has come. I'm sure we'll have some others join us here shortly. But we're going to go ahead and get things kicked off. Welcome to the Design Systems Workshop. This is session 2 or part 2 of a 2-part series. If you can hear me, that's great. Give me a thumbs up. Give me a message in the chat just to make sure everything's groovy. If you ever have any issues, technically speaking, thanks, Ellie. Appreciate the thumbs up. If you ever have any technical issues, just send a message to either Ellie or drop it in the chat, and we'll make sure to get that sorted out. So if this is your first time attending the Design Systems Workshop, welcome. We did do a part 1 already. We're going to do a quick review, so no worries if you weren't able to make it to that first one. But in this second one, we're super excited to talk about all kinds of new information. First and foremost, if you've not been to a digital workshop, just some quick etiquette. This is what we've kind of learned over the past couple weeks as we've been working from home ourselves. So please mute yourself during the presentation. I have control over that, so if I hear you tip typing away, I may just mute you. Don't take offense to that. Just want to make sure that it's a great experience for everyone who's here. Second, we are going to have Q&A at the end, so just save your questions until the end. If you have one that you don't want to forget, write it down, drop it in the chat, and at the Q&A, we'll see if we can get to it. Number 3, video on or off, completely up to you. We would love to see your smiling faces just to see, see who's here. But of course, ultimately, that's up to you. Number 4, please take screenshots. That's what this is for. Share them on Twitter, share them on Instagram, send them to your grandma, whatever you want to do, but please take screenshots. And then lastly, feel free to use the chat as needed during the presentation if you want to ask a question, or if you want to have sort of a private conversation with someone else. I believe you can also do direct messages inside of Zoom. So take advantage of that. All righty, so welcome to the Design Systems Workshop live on Zoom. Like I said, this is session 2 of a 2-session or 2-part workshop. My name's John Moore. I'm the Principal Design Partner at Innovatemap. If you've not heard of Innovatemap, we're based in Indianapolis, Indiana, which is right smack dab in the Midwest of the United States. If you're not from the US, we're about 3 hours from Chicago. So at Innovatemap, we're a digital product agency. We help startups, scale-ups, and tech-enabled businesses grow their companies through product expertise and disciplines: design, product management, product marketing, product brand, and research. We are laser focused in on product. That's all we care about. We don't write any code. That's kind of what sets us apart. So ultimately, what we care about is we want to make sure you're building the right thing for the right people. Just quickly, if you came to the first session, yes, I am going over some of these slides again, but this is just for the new folks to introduce myself to them. What you didn't see in the first workshop is the shirt. You may have seen it in the photo here on the slide, but I decided it would be appropriate to match exactly what was on the slide, just to make sure that I'm not an imposter presenting. So yeah, I studied computer science, and my background is in machine learning. Through a series of managers and things like that, made my way into a UX team working in-house at a big software company here in Indianapolis. Worked there for several years and then ultimately left to join the product team at Innovatemap, and eventually came to lead the UX design discipline here at the agency. And here I've had the pleasure of working with over 150 clients across all kinds of different industries. We see all kinds of different problems and opportunities where design systems can help them out. And not just help them out, but help us out so that we can be as efficient and as consistent as possible when we're helping them build out their businesses. So enough about me. Let's go ahead and do a quick review of what we talked about last time. So if you're in part 1 of the Design Systems Workshop, this is what we covered. We talked a little about history, a little quick history lesson. We talked about why might you build a design system? What's the point of it? What's the purpose? We went into the different phases of maturity of a design system, which is to say that it's not 0 or 100. This is something that you will grow through throughout your journey as not only a design team, but as a business as a whole. And then lastly, we talked about the different elements inside of a system itself. Quick session 1 review, takeaways from there that we shared. A design system is a common set of tools and resources for team unity and efficiency. There are tons of different factors that can determine how sophisticated your system needs to be, which means that you don't need to use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Just because you've seen the IBM design system or the Salesforce Lightning design system or the Carbon design system doesn't mean that yours needs to have an entire website and pages of documentation and an entire development design tooling team. So don't use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So for all intents and purposes, you are now up to speed. And in today's session, we're going to talk about actually activating this thing. So kind of four different phases that we're going to go through in this presentation. First and foremost, we're going to talk about a product approach and how you can sort of approach getting this system built out. Secondly, we'll talk about prioritization. How do you prioritize all the different things that could possibly go into your design system? Talk about some challenges that you're inevitably going to face, that anyone would face. Talk about some resources that will help you build these things out. And then lastly, I'm just going to give you a peek at an exercise that we do with our clients when we are going through kind of design system prioritization. It'll give you some ideas if you're thinking about doing this at your business or with your design team. So let's get started on the product approach. So when I say product approach, I specifically mean like, how are you going to get this thing built? When it comes to design systems, you really need to design first and then deconstruct. There's this big misconception that design systems are born just out of thin air, and that's not the case. Design systems are always born out of product and features and not the other way around, which is to say you really need to build something first before you can actually identify all the different Lego pieces that you can break it down into to really systematize and optimize into a system to be shared across your organization. So first and foremost, start with a known need and just work backwards. What we generally do is we will either design maybe a new feature or take inventory of an existing feature, and we'll start to break it down into those individual pieces. Think about it like taking a Lego model and then breaking it down into all the individual bricks and then putting those into their own little boxes or Ziploc bags to keep everything organized. Same sort of idea there. Once you take inventory, then you really have to validate and iterate on the design and the experience. This is super important because you really don't want to be systematizing bad design. So if you maybe have an existing product and you're wondering, well, how can I actually turn this existing product into a design system? Fear not. It's very common. That's what most people do, and that's actually the right way to do it. You have to build it out before you can break it down. But that doesn't mean that you have to have your entire product designed out to be able to break it down. If you just have it for one or two features, that's great. That'll give you a really good head start to start validating and really iterating on the design and the experience to make sure that you're not going to be systematizing bad design. Next, cross-validate that design and experience with other features in the product. Things that you'll want to look at here is, what are the shared components? What are the shared tokens or different page patterns that are being used, different interactions? And then from there, you can actually start to build out that inventory and sort of that UI audit of all the different pieces inside of your product and identify places where you may need to build some new ones. Identify commonalities. That will help you in your prioritization, and that's kind of our next section here. So hold on to that thought for a second. What I wanted to show here, so I'm kind of a hobbyist photographer, and when you think about sort of this product approach to a design system, the reason why I say it this way is because if you think about this Canon AE1, that's the model that we're looking at here. If you think about this camera here, they wouldn't have necessarily had all of these individual components built first and then decided, okay, what can we build with this thing? Of course, we don't know. We know that that's not how products are built. Instead, they probably would have had 1, 2, 3, 20, 50 different prototypes of this different camera. And then once they actually settled on a design and said, this is exactly what we want to build and exactly what we want it to look like, then they break it down into the pieces and they send them off to different parts of the manufacturing plant or other organizations to get those manufactured. And really that is breaking it apart and systematizing all those different pieces. So when you think about building out a design system in your organization now, consider a similar approach where you take an existing feature, or maybe you're working on a new feature, build it out, perfect the experience, validate it, and cross-reference it with other features inside the product, and then start to break it down into its pieces and parts. So next in the product approach, as with any good product, you have a team behind it. Design systems are no different. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start building out the individual members who may make sense to be put onto a design team if you're building one out, if you have those resources and the luxury to do that. But just know that the order in which I'm doing them is the order in which I think it's important to start building these things out. It doesn't mean that there are going to be 6 of them. Doesn't mean that you need 6 people from day one if you're a small startup. It also doesn't mean you need 6 people if you're, Salesforce or some other giant enterprise level company. But these are just some things that you can consider that will really help you build out a very robust design system. So first and foremost, obviously, a lot of us are designers in here. For a design system, you need someone to actually design the components themselves. Obviously, super important. What is worth mentioning here is it's not just the visual design of the components themselves, but also the experience and sort of the interactions as you work with those different pieces as well. Next, and I'm actually going to build one more. I tend to think that an engineer kind of comes next in the phase before, say, a product manager or PM does. And the reason why is because ultimately you need to get these things built out. And I think for smaller organizations, if maybe you're a startup, you have a smaller design team, or maybe you're just lower on resources and you're not able to have a dedicated PM to the design systems team, the designer can kind of do a lot of that work with regards to gathering requirements and making sure that they're building all the features up to standard. So really that next person you should consider is an engineer. In the best case scenario, it is a separate person who can work side by side with that designer to make sure that those components not only look great, but they work great and all the interactions and the different states are spelled out perfectly, not only in the visual design itself, but in the code as well. So of course, it'd be great if you have a PM. To any of the PMs who are on my team at Innovatemap, I just want to say thank you because you keep my head on straight and you make sure that I, comb my hair every day. Honestly, I could not do my job without my PMs and engagement leads. So a PM is super important for design systems because they're really going to make sure that things are prioritized accurately and effectively. They're going to make sure that all the requirements are there so that as a designer like me is building out those different pieces, they're making sure to cover all the ground that's necessary. And then lastly, they're just going to make sure everything is on track and moving smoothly so that you're going to get this thing built out and it doesn't sort of drag on over time like we know projects like this can do. Next, an animator, which may seem a little bit soon, but it'll make more sense once we see these other 2 roles that I'm going to talk about. I like to split out an animator separate from a designer just because I believe that you can be, incredibly talented at animation and throwing all of your focus toward motion and animation and really documenting that animation system and that motion system, I think is very important and entirely separate from the design itself. The reason why I put it forth is because obviously you need all of these top level roles before you can think about animating different components and things like that. But I just wanted to note animation and motion because it is very important, and also know that this is not just inside the product itself. It's anywhere where you might see animation, because when you think about a design system, it's not just serving the product, it serves the whole business. So that could be animations on the website. It could be animations inside of a sales demo or any of your external videos that maybe you're producing inside of your marketing team. Next, we get into tooling. This is where we start to get pretty advanced because the people who are able to dedicate resources to an individual or a small team who focuses solely on tooling are generally very large organizations. Airbnb, I know, has a design systems tooling team, and their entire role, as far as I understand it, is to develop different tools and different resources that will help the designers and the developers and everyone else involved in product really efficiently and effectively use the different pieces of the design system itself. It's very, very advanced. We're going to go through some different resources later on that you can use as you're sort of building it out. And that will enable you to sort of do tooling on your own. So you don't necessarily need to have your own separate person who only focuses on that thing. And then lastly, we get into the policeman. This is really just governance. And governance is kind of a big sort of vague word, but really what governance is a QA person. This is someone who is looking at the different features inside of the design system and then cross-referencing them with everything that's been built in the product itself and making sure that everything jives, that you're using the right different pieces inside of the system, and so that everything is fulfilling the necessary requirements of the product and also the system itself. Because ultimately the point of a system is to optimize and make everything consistent. And if things aren't consistent in the product, then that may mean you have a little bit of an issue when it comes to governance, because maybe your designers aren't using all the components that they should be from the system, or maybe the developers are reusing some code in an inefficient way, and maybe they should be doing it some other way. So I'm going to quickly pop over to how do you grow a design system. So there are tons of different pieces inside of a design system, and let me switch over my share here so that you can see what I'm looking at here. All right, so when you think about design system governance and really considering how you are going to build out and add different components to the system itself, it's not as easy as just saying, well, we have this new button, should we add it into the system? Yes or no. It's actually a little bit more involved than that. And I'm going to go through that right now. So let's say you have a new feature that comes in, a new request for a feature, or maybe a specific component. I do want to say this is an adaptation of something that Brad Frost put together around design system governance, but we kind of put our own sort of internal spin on this. So the first step inside of this process of governance and considering whether or not this thing needs to go in is asking the question, does this component exist already? If it does, then you can ask the question, does it actually fulfill all the necessary requirements? Yes or no. If it does, congratulations, pat yourself on the back, use that existing component. You're sort of done at this point. If you're not sure, or if the component does not exist already, it kind of takes you to the step where you really have to do a discovery with that design systems team. What this involves and what it will probably look like is maybe sitting down with that PM who says, okay, we need to build out this new feature, this new component, and this is what it needs to do. When they sit down with the designer or maybe the design systems team, if you have the resources to build one out, sitting down and doing a discovery will basically collect all the requirements for that new feature, understand what it is, and then start looking at the system itself to see if that thing already exists. If there's truly nothing new, again, pat yourself on the back, get yourself a Coca-Cola because you can use that existing component and you have no extra work to do. If, however, it is a new need, then again, there's another question that you need to ask yourself. Will this be an alteration of an existing component, or are we truly creating something absolutely new? If it's really sort of a one-off component, this is something that doesn't necessarily need to go into the system itself. We'll get into this in the prioritization exercise, but these would be things like very unique visualizations. Those are things that, like, they need to get built and they need to get put into the product, but you may or may not actually need to put them in the system itself. And I'm going to repeat that over and over in this presentation because that's kind of what's important here. Is it's that question of whether or not this thing needs to be systematized, not whether or not it needs to be designed. There are things that need to be designed and built, but may or may not actually make it into the system itself. So on the other hand, let's say it is a system component. Well, in that case, it'll be added to the design system teams, say that 5 times fast, backlog of things that they need to build out. And then we just kind of go into a normal process that we're all familiar with regards to design. You gather your requirements, you design and iterate, you build and test that thing, you get final sign-off, you start documenting the component in all the different states and the way that it should work and the business logic. You add that thing to the design systems library, and then ultimately you want to update the library and release that to all the designers and or the developers who are using it. This is kind of an important step because as you're sort of building this, you need to iterate and make sure that this thing is perfect so that once it goes into the hands of designers who are going to be using it, you want to make sure that that is final. And when you push that update using whatever design tool that you use, when you push that update to your design team, chances are they may be using that thing that very day. So you just want to make sure that everything is absolutely ready at that point. So let me pop back over to PowerPoint. All right. Thank you, Ellie, for sharing that. Appreciate that. Whimsical is a wonderful tool. We're not being paid, although if they'd like to pay us, then feel free to email us. That'd be great. So next, we want to talk about prioritization. So prioritization is really about, okay, what sort of comes first? I really believe prioritization needs to be a shared exercise. This is not something that just the designer can sit down and do. They're just one small piece of a much larger prioritization exercise that needs to happen. So in terms of like jobs to be done, I'm just going to quickly kind of fill these out and then talk through them. Product designers, job that needs to be done is really going through and performing a UI inventory and an audit, collecting all the different components that are inside of the product and across the different features. Literally write them down, make an Excel spreadsheet, and really just start to collect and inventory all those different components, different tokens, different page layouts, different interactions, and things of that nature. Product managers are gathering requirements and making sure that all those components are accurately being designed and built correctly. Development really needs to participate in prioritization because just because something may be easy to design, it does not necessarily mean it's easy to build. So they are crucial in this prioritization as it comes to sizing and build effort. The brand team, which may or may not be part of marketing, can do sort of a visual language audit. This is similar to kind of that UI inventory, but this is really starting to look at all the different brand elements that may have made their way into the product itself or onto the website. These are things like illustration. These are things like colors, typefaces, things of that nature. And then they can also work with the marketing team to make sure that the messaging and the tone for things like empty states or maybe onboarding or wizards and things like that align well to the tone of your business and your product as a whole. So let's look at a matrix. When it comes to prioritizing the different pieces that may or may not make it into a system, I like to split it into an axis like this. It's been a long time since I did geometry, so hang in there with me for a second. On the x-axis, we have basically the complexity of the element or the component itself, from easy to complex. And then on the y-axis, we have how common or how rare this particular element or component may be in the product or on your website. And then there may actually be a third axis, although it was really hard to design in PowerPoint. And that third axis I would mark as being value. And I think value is really important too, because when you think about systematizing things, there are certain things that are much more valuable to systematize than other things. So when you think about this upper left-hand quadrant, these are things that are super easy and very, very common. We all know what these things are. These are things like buttons and text fields and checkboxes and toggles and things like that. You see them all over the place. They're very, very common. Obviously, these will be some of the first things that you bake into your design system. I do want to put a little asterisk next to it, which is to say, if you're actually starting from a UI framework, something like Bootstrap or Bulma, B-U-L-M-A, or Semantic UI or any of these other kind of UI frameworks, a lot of these elements are going to be in there already. And so the exercise is really more from a design standpoint to just match up whatever you end up with in that UI framework. On the other end of the spectrum, you have super rare and super complex components or pieces to build out. Those are things like very unique controls or components, special page layouts, unusual visualizations. Again, what I want to say here is when we're talking about prioritization and prioritizing these different components, we're not prioritizing designing them. The fact of the matter is if you have a really unusual visualization that is going to absolutely knock it out of the park inside of your product and sales is going to do backflips because it's going to be so great in a demo, that's awesome. It needs to be designed, it needs to be built, it needs to go into the product, but it may or may not need to go into the system itself. If it's just a one-off component and you're probably never going to see that again, you may or may not need to go through all the detailed exercise of documentation and things of that nature. So next we have components that are complex, but they're super common inside of the product. So these are things like search autocomplete. You see that all over the place. Date pickers are just notoriously a nightmare to design and build. Global search, these are super common in pretty much every product, but they're a little bit more complex to build and to design. In this quadrant, we have things that are maybe easy to design or build, but they're pretty rare inside of the product itself. Things like range sliders, those are those little sliders, progress bars, toast notifications. These things are pretty easy to design. We could design them in our sleep. Honestly, most developers could just build these in their sleep as well, but they're pretty rare. So you may not need to prioritize getting these systematized. Again, systematized. So I'd always start with these, like I said, or these. I'm not sure which direction I'm pointing. There we go, over there. Buttons, text fields, and toggles. Those are easy. Those are common. You'll get a lot of those for free if you're working with the UI framework already. Second, I would actually go with these more complex but very common pieces. This is because you're going to be using them all over. And so anything that sort of falls above that y-axis and starts to trend towards being super common inside of the product, those are the things that I would start with or kind of hit next. Then I would go to kind of those easier but maybe rarer pieces. And the reason why is because these down here, big old question mark, they may or may not actually make it into the system, into the library. They'll probably be in the product. That's great. But if you're only going to be using them on a couple different pages or just one page, there may not be a reason to actually systematize it. All right, we're doing great on time. So let's jump to challenges. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there are some considerations that you should have top of mind as you are building. The fact of the matter is design systems are super hard, but they're very, very worth it. Some of the challenges you're going to experience when you're building or attempting to build or start a design systems project: executive buy-in. First and foremost, you have to convince leadership that this is worth spending time and resources on, because ultimately this may mean that a designer or a couple people are dedicating a lot of their time throughout the day to systematizing and documenting these components. And it's just a big undertaking. And so getting that executive buy-in can be difficult. But what I would recommend is, if you are having trouble getting executive buy-in, always start with a problem or identify an opportunity. Is there a problem that you guys are experiencing by not having a design system? Or is there an opportunity that would surface by building out a design system and offering it to designers and others inside of the organization? Team resourcing and staffing, like I said, if you're a smaller business, maybe a startup, this can be challenging. You maybe only have one designer and one PM. And it can be hard to just get those dedicated resources and staff onto a design systems team. So just take it slowly. If you were in session 1, you saw when we talked about the different phases of maturity of a design system. Go back and review those and consider sort of where you are and what your objectives are with building out this design system. And that will help you sort of prioritize the different staffing needs and different team members and roles that you may need to satisfy to get this system built out. This is huge. Systematizing bad existing design patterns. As you're looking at a product and looking to build out a system, don't just break it down and start making symbols and components inside of Sketch and Figma. That's great, but if you end up systematizing bad patterns, then that sucks. You know, when they build any new car, if they do a crash test and it turns out the bumpers are super faulty, well, they don't want to systematize a faulty bumper because everything that's built thereafter obviously is not going to be great. And so systematizing bad existing design patterns can be a challenge. So you do have to take a step back and really consider all of these different components and put them through the ringer and make sure that they are truly the components that need to make it into the system. Compliance. Oh, compliance. It's just going to be difficult getting everyone to use the different tools that you put in place, and we'll talk about those in a second, and getting everyone to use buttons the way that buttons ought to be used and use dropdowns the way that dropdowns ought to be used. I strongly recommend, if you do have the resources, to build out a team of maybe one or two or a couple different people. Have them, as they're sort of building out the system and creating new components that go into that library, have them present to others inside of the organization, present to the other designers, present to the marketing team, so that as they're considering building out the website, there may be experiential things that they want to put onto, a web page. Show them to the sales team so that they understand the value of why these different components are so easy to use and why the experience of the product is worth these prospects investing their money into. And then lastly, scaling the system. We went through that governance and sort of compliance process before, but the fact of the matter is that just takes time too. It's difficult. And, as you're trying to move rapidly and in an agile manner and building out your product, everyone knows that decisions are made very quickly. And sometimes those things can fall through the cracks. And before you know it, you have this pile of design system components under the porch that didn't actually make it into the system. So scaling that system is difficult to do. But you can do it, I promise. So lastly, on this piece, before we jump over to a quick exercise and example, are the resources. And sorry if you just heard, we have motorcycle gangs, I think, that drive up and down the street. So I apologize for that. So now we're going to talk about resources. These are really just tools for getting the job done. And while you may think that they're just design tools, you're wrong. They're actually tools for all kinds of different purposes when it comes to building out and maintaining this design system. You have tools for designers. These are things like Sketch and shared libraries. Figma is another design tool. Adobe XD for experience design. InVision Studio. And there are a myriad of other tools that are out there that are sort of up and coming as well. But these are sort of the stars of the show nowadays. If you're a designer, you know these already. If you're a PM, if you're maybe someone on the leadership team, these are the types of things that someone on a design team might ask for a license for. So just keep that in mind. When it comes to version control, this is super important for design system libraries because you have to be able to track sort of an audit trail and a history of how things have evolved over time. So when it comes to auditing the versions of the design, you can start looking at tools like Abstract, InVision DSM, or Design System Manager. There's a great tool called Plant. I believe that version control is also built into Figma and maybe Sketch. If someone knows that, feel free to drop that in the chat. But I know Figma has it, and I think Sketch has it as well. If not, it's coming this year. Then we get into version control of the components themselves as they're sort of being built out into code. That's when you get into things like GitHub and Bitbucket and all those different code resources that, frankly, I don't fully understand myself. But they're very important because you can track those things as they're getting built out. Communication tools, Slack, Microsoft Teams, GitHub. This is just communicating changes to your system, communicating progress, and communicating all those different rules around the different components and pieces of the system so that a designer knows how to use a dropdown and a developer knows when to use a dropdown and so on and so forth. So communication tools are just as important as anything else. Tracking tools, really just making sure that everyone's on the same page and you're working toward a shared goal. Things like Trello, Airtable. There's a cool tool called ClickUp. Asana, Jira, these are sort of in ascending order of complexity. Something like Trello, very, very simple. Something like Jira, super heavyweight, but very common in these dev organizations. Carl placed a great link for Figma and version history. He said Figma does have version history. Thanks, Carl. Appreciate that. So then lastly is documentation. This is documenting not only the progress and sort of the projects as you're breaking down the system and getting it built, but also documenting how things work and how they should be used in practice. So again, in sort of increasing order of complexity, something like Airtable, we're huge fans of Airtable. It's kind of like an online Excel if you've not used it before. Something like Dropbox Paper or Google Docs. Lingo is a standalone desktop app that will allow you to store design system components and brand components. And it's pretty cool because you can share that with others in the organization if they need to download a logo or if they need to understand what the proper messaging should be for a certain feature or tool. Envision DSM also has detailed documentation capabilities, GitHub, and then all the way up to a custom site. Custom site, that's what we see for things like the Salesforce Lightning System, Google Material Design. These are like websites that the public, like morons like you and me, can actually go to, and we can see how they built this thing out and copy a lot of the stuff because they've done a lot of the hard work already. But those custom sites can be very useful, but maybe not necessary if you're a startup. We're getting a flurry of chats. I'm going to check this really quickly. Notion also has a design systems template. Thank you. That's great. Teamwork.com. Yeah, definitely check out the chat because some folks are sharing some other great tools in there as well. So I want to jump over to a quick prioritization exercise sample. Obviously, we can't all do this at the same time. There are 64 of us. That would be a lot of people and a lot of cooks in the kitchen. But I do just want to show you an exercise that we go through with our clients when we are helping them prioritize their system. So the goal of this is we want to assess all possible components for your design system. Sorry about that. And prioritize them into a must-have, nice-to-have, and kind of a future bucket. So let me jump over to that. All righty. All right, so we should be looking at another whimsical diagram. And we'll pop this out. So this is basically a breakdown of what we have identified as being all the different tokens, pieces, components, patterns, interactions that you may or may not come across when you're building out a product. This is not all-inclusive. There are certainly additional things to consider, but we sort of broke them down this way. We color-coded them by category. UI elements, I've also heard of these called tokens. That's how you can kind of distinguish between those and components. But basically, we just made different cards here. And the exercise is to take these different cards and drop them into these buckets up here. Now, these buckets can be generic in the way that we've done them here. Bucket number 1 is sort of a must-have. Bucket number 2 is nice to have. And bucket number 3 is future. Instead, you could actually put time around these. Maybe this is Q1, quarter 2, and then next year, way off in the future. The purpose of this exercise, though, is to really look at all these different pieces down here and consider of them, what is our priority for getting them systematized? I know I keep saying that, but that's what's really important here is systematizing these things versus just building them and rolling them out into the product itself. Just because a modal dialogue is something that you can design and create, maybe it doesn't make sense in your product to actually add into the system. Things like a wizard. You may have one page or one feature in your product that uses a wizard, but you never use it in any of your other features. It's up to you. You may or may not actually document that thing in detail and build it out and put it into the system. So when we're going through this exercise, it's really fun. We basically just have them drag these different things into their appropriate sections. And Whimsical, again, we're not affiliated with them, but it's great. We'll really nicely sort of organize these things because I am I'm a control freak and I need everything to be very well aligned. I shouldn't say I'm a control freak. I should just say that I'm a designer. That's what any designer would do. But they have this great feature called, I think, Post-it notes or something like that. And that's what we're looking at here. So that's the exercise. And what you get at the end is you get this nice prioritized buckets of must-have, nice-to-have, and things to consider in the future for building out that design system. Now, there is another step in this, and that next step is to go into this must-have column and decide what the priority is for these individual pieces. So maybe you want to do buttons before the typographic definitions, which wouldn't make sense. But there is that sort of secondary step of prioritizing these things once you get them in their appropriate lanes. So let me pop back over to PowerPoint. So very quickly, final takeaways, and then I have a couple links that I wanted to share with you, and then we'll jump into Q&A. So don't everyone leave yet, because there's lots of great conversation to be had yet. So first and foremost, design systems are born out of products and features, not the other way around. You got to build something first before you can tear it down and break it apart into its pieces. Number two, prioritize for reuse, efficiency, and value. When you're thinking about those individual pieces of your system, you want to think about what's going to be reused, what's going to help us be very, very efficient, and what are the most valuable for putting into the system. Number three, establishing a team and a process for management. If you don't have the resources and you don't have the staffing to be able to build out a team, that's okay. If you're just a sole designer on a design team or maybe working with one other person, that's great. Just come up with a process for designing out those components, getting them documented, and working with whoever your developers are to really get those things built out and put into the system. And lastly, design systems are hard, but they're very, very, very worth it. So it's, take the time, take a step back. It's going to make you as a designer much faster. If you're not a designer watching right now, it's going to make your organization much more efficient and much more performant. They're going to be able to churn out new features and new designs, new pages on the website faster than you've ever seen before. And not only that, they'll be super consistent and just a great user experience for everyone. So before you go, and as we transition into Q&A, Ellie, my colleague, is going to post some links to these different places. If you could, or if you're interested, join the Better Product community. That is a community of other product professionals just like you. So there are product designers in there. There are product managers, product marketers, all kinds of different people who are just passionate about building out digital products. Next, follow me on LinkedIn, say hello, would love to meet you. And then lastly, if you do want to learn more about Innovatemap, or if you have any questions about building out a design system or even need help getting yours underway, hit us up. And thank you, Ellie, for popping those in the chat. Now we enter into Q&A. So again, before we had some etiquette for a digital workshop, here we have some etiquette for Q&A. So if you could, go ahead and type your question into the chat if you have one. I'm going to pick a question and answer it. And then hopefully the answer is so great that you love it and you will erupt into applause in your personal quarantines. So I'm going to take a peek at the chat and see what we've got coming. All right, Carl is asking, are there any special considerations for variants of things like entry fields that need various kinds of validation? That's a great question. And absolutely, that is part of building out the system. If I understand your question correctly, it is, you may have a text field, but there are all kinds of different variations of a text field. So you could have a text field with icons, and you could have a text field that has autocomplete, or you could have a text field that has built-in validation, or it has sort of a keyboard pattern that you have to follow, like a phone number field, things like that. Absolutely, those things should make it into the documentation, and it's up to you how far you decide you want to take those. If you want to spell out every possible text field or button or whatever it may be that needs to be built, by all means go for it. But it may be a little bit more time intensive to do that. So it just it's based on what your prioritization is. But for things like validation, definitely put those rules with it. If you have the luxury of really documenting those and taking the time to do that. If not, just make sure that as a designer, you're making sure to cover all those different requirements for those particular types of elements. Susie asked, do you think it's worth using a library ready for basic components in order to be faster? Great question. This is fantastic. If we're talking from a design standpoint, well, I won't even say if. The answer is yes, absolutely. I'm a firm believer that in today's modern world, it's very hard to be truly innovative and do something for the first time, because the fact of the matter is that someone's already done it before. And so in a lot of cases, there's no need for you to put in all the hard work. If you can find a nice design system sort of starter kit or boilerplate that maybe already exists. That'll save you a lot of time, because there are things like buttons that it doesn't matter if you design it or someone else designs it. It's going to be a rectangle with some text on top of it. There are other ways that you can sort of build and construct them inside of your design tools, but absolutely, if there are resources out there, use them. And especially if you find maybe more of like a vanilla design system starter kit, go ahead and use that. We have built one internally at Innovatemap, and we have used it for the past 5 years and built literally everything off of that base system. That doesn't mean that all the products that we create end up looking the same, but all the base elements are built off of the same sort of construction and engineering, so that we can be super efficient. And ultimately, when it comes to designing out a page, our UX designers have so many hotkeys under their fingers that they can build out a page very efficiently. Jane asked, who would you typically involve in a prioritization exercise like this? Wonderful question. As many people, okay, let me take a step back. That's a dangerous thing to say. The individuals that we talked about in, let me jump back to this, all the way in the beginning. Stand by, talk amongst yourselves. The individuals we talked about in sort of that design systems team, these are people who you would consider pulling into that prioritization exercise. At minimum, a designer, either the head of product or a PM, and maybe the head of engineering. These are going to be the primary people who are going to help you prioritize which components you pursue first and which ones you may wait on to put into that system. Some of these other people, it would be great to get them in. As far as like a QA person or someone who's maybe building out the tooling, I think they'll absolutely have an input. Everyone has an input and an opinion, but for that exercise, they may not be absolutely critical. All righty, what else we got? Okay, Alan, a doozy of a question, so I'm gonna see if I can answer as much of it as possible quickly. Once you have a design system established, how often should you re-review it and allow changes to the system? That's a great question. There needs to be some level of commitment to a system, and that's why I think it's so important to spend a lot of time up front, really validating those pieces and parts to make sure that this is the time that you want to spend maybe redesigning something, maybe revisiting an interaction or a workflow. It's important to spend that time up front so that down the road, you don't end up going, shoot, we missed something, and then you have to kind of either start over or make a lot of different changes. That being said, absolutely, these things can be revisited. Just make sure that they align to kind of the objectives of the business. Thought process. If you try to be too agile and change your system monthly or more often, then it's a pain to maintain and keep the team up to speed on the system. If you're too rigid or never change, you could be losing value. What's the sweet spot? It just depends. I mean, it's such a bad answer, and I feel like that's every workshop answer as well. It depends, but it really depends on the size of your business. If you're a startup and you're just trying to get an MVP out the door and a system to enable your designers to be performant and efficient, then you can maybe spend a little bit less time up front and just continue to evolve and make changes to the system and updates to the system over time. I think in the earlier phases of building out a design system, you'll start to see a lot more changes. Happens to me all the time. I maybe construct a button a certain way inside of my design tool, and then I decide, oh shoot, there's probably a better way that I could build this. So I'll go back and I'll change kind of the construction of that button, the pieces and parts, and then I'll roll that out to the people who are using the system and let them know what those changes are. So I think the earlier on in the process you are, the more flexible it can or maybe should be, but the further on you are in building out your design system, then the more protective you should be of it. I'm going to scroll up just a little bit. Maggie, what are some common objections you've heard to building a design system, and how did you overcome them? Great question. Probably the biggest objection that you're probably going to hear, and I'm going to jump back to, let's see, challenges. There we go. Okay, Some of the biggest objections you're going to encounter as you're sort of building this out is that executive buy-in and kind of team resourcing and staffing, like full stop. That's probably going to be first and foremost, just because if you're trying to get a product out the door, you're trying to build a feature, if you don't have enough people or enough time or resources to do it, then prioritizing building out that system and being very thoughtful about those components and pieces, it's just going to fall by the wayside and, you know, be put on the back burner. And so those, you know, for those reasons, it basically makes it difficult to get that system built out. To overcome that, if that's the case, as a designer, that doesn't mean that you need to get official approval to say, hey, I'm going to systemize this thing. And to any executives who are listening, hang on for a second, because that probably sounds like a funny answer. What I mean is, if you're a designer on a team and there hasn't been an official charter to say, hey, let's build out a design system, that doesn't mean that you can't, as a professional designer, take your time and be thoughtful in the way that you design your files and the way that you create pieces so that you can optimize for reusability and your own efficiency. Ultimately, you're making your own job easier, which will down the line make other people's jobs easier. So even if it's not an official charter from the top, it doesn't mean that you can't do it yourself. And so there is a balance there. Let's see. Philip is asking, once a component is systematized and you have a source of truth for that component, the product may have several one-offs that are now inconsistent with the system, but functional. How do you advocate or prioritize getting those inconsistencies addressed when PMs just want to build new features? I love that question. That's a good one. Honestly, you could ask that same exact question, but instead of one-off components, you could just replace it with like bugs or anything else that is sort of in that, you know, code debt that sort of builds up basically from day one. It really is a great question. I think it depends a little bit on your build cycle. So if you're on kind of a 4 or a 6 week sprint cycle, and there, you know, you sort of start the first 4 weeks doing maybe some discovery and then design and iteration. And then in the latter parts, you're sort of hardening or basically not doing anything new. It does give you an opportunity to, as a designer, kind of go into the tool or into maybe some other features and do sort of a red line exercise on those to identify places where there may be inconsistencies. And at that point, kind of the best way that I've seen it done is if you can identify a reason why it's bad, that they're inconsistent, or convince either development or PMs or someone else in product that there are things to be gained by actually getting this thing systematized, then that will help you pull that thing up in their own prioritization list. If it's something like a one-off for a page, you know, if you have a friend who sits over in development and you can say, hey, let's swap out this button for the system button, then, you know, you can try that. If you're in a big organization, it's probably not going to make it through that code review, but it's worth a shot. So, all right, let's do one more question before we pop out. And on getting buy-in from leadership, better to ask for forgiveness or permission. If you're a designer, I would say forgiveness, although I don't really view it as being forgiveness, because I think you're doing a service to the design team and to the organization by making yourself just better and making your output more efficient and consistent. So I think you're kind of doing a service by doing that, but at the same time, like, make sure that you're not taking so much time away from actual priorities, building out new features and things like that. So, which is to say, if you have a slow day, spend some time on your file and cleaning it up, and for God's sake, name your layers, and building out your components and your symbols so that they are architected in a smart and easily reusable way. And that'll just make things easy for you as a designer to sort of build that thing out. So I would say forgiveness, then permission. But that being said, if it is going to be a big project and you actually do get buy-in from it, then absolutely, you know, you should prioritize that. And in that case, you should be responding accordingly to whatever those things are. coming down from leadership. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, say thank you all so much for coming. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you, Ellie, for helping me out. To others who have attended, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking some time. Be healthy, continue learning, keep watching the things that we're putting out on LinkedIn, on Twitter. Just follow Innovatemap. You'll be able to see other workshops like this that we're putting on. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for coming. It's been wonderful. And I believe we're going to be following up with links to all these resources, the deck, and things like that. So thank you again. Really appreciate it. Take care, everyone. See you later, everyone.